Even the most devout servants of God can experience discouragement and exhaustion, allowing their circumstances to overwhelm their daily trust in Him. Elijah, a prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel, had been a witness to and a performer of some of the most remarkable miracles recorded in the Bible. Nevertheless, he succumbed to depression and fear when King Ahab and his wife, Queen Jezebel, threatened his life. Ahab was not an ideal king. The Bible describes him as doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, more than all the kings before him. 1 Kings 16:30. He married Jezebel, a princess from Sidon, who fervently worshipped the false god Baal. Together, they led Israel into Baal worship, angering God. The Israelites believed that worshiping Baal and Asherah, his female counterpart, would bring fertility to their land. This worship contradicted the Israelites' covenant with God, which is why prophets like Elijah opposed it. Elijah was sent by God to challenge this system and confront the corrupt leadership of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. The situation escalated, especially with Queen Jezebel's strong support for Baal and Asherah worship. Ahab saw Elijah not as a messenger of truth, but as a troublemaker. Yet, Elijah boldly delivered God's message, challenging an entire belief system at a time when faith in God was challenged by the widespread practice of idol worship. A severe drought followed, lasting for years as Elijah had prophesied. This was not just a natural event, but a spiritual lesson for Israel. The drought mirrored the spiritual dryness in the people's hearts. Sometimes it takes a significant event to open our eyes to the truth and turn us back to the right path. This is what God was doing for Israel, calling them back to Himself and showing the futility of idol worship. But He Himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And He asked that He might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." 1 Kings 19:4. Elijah secluded himself even further, beyond Beersheba, praying for death. This remarkable man, known for his powerful prayers that could stop and start the rain, now prayed for his own end. Fortunately, Elijah's prayer was not answered. Sometimes receiving a no from God is better than a yes. Elijah seemed to express, "I can't do this anymore, Lord." Despite his great work on Mount Carmel, which did not lead to a lasting national revival, the stress and exhaustion made him feel like he was accomplishing nothing. Elijah may have forgotten that people often reject God despite the evidence. After examining his perceived failure, he blamed himself and his ancestors. It's a common misconception that prophets never feel down, but Elijah's story shows that even they experienced difficult moments. When God found Elijah in his despair, He did not abandon him. Instead, the Lord lifted him up, placed him back in the battle, gave him valuable help in the form of the prophet Elisha, and then took him away to heaven in a whirlwind. God first took care of Elijah's physical needs. Although it's not always the case, physical needs are important, and sometimes getting enough rest and replenishment can be the most spiritual thing a person can do. The escape to the brook Cherith was to teach Elijah to rely on the Lord. During a dry spell, he had to trust that God would keep the brook flowing. He had to accept food from ravens, which were unclean creatures. "I have commanded the ravens to feed you there," God said. 1 Kings 17:4. Although the ravens could feed him anywhere, God specifically directed them to provide for him at Cherith. Despite Elijah's potential desire to be elsewhere, preaching or engaged in other activities, God wanted him to be at Cherith and assured him that his needs would be met. Elijah, the prophet from the Bible, was fed by ravens during a time of famine. However, every morsel of food he received came from the beak of an unclean animal, which taught him to emphasize the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. God commanded, and the ravens came. Imagine Elijah sitting alone by the brook Cherith when suddenly a flock of black ravens swoops in. These weren't just any birds. They were ravens, often seen as unclean scavengers, yet they brought bread and meat to Elijah. This wasn't a coincidence or a random act of nature. It was God's command, and the ravens obeyed, becoming unlikely providers for the prophet. Think about how much food a family consumes in a week. If you've ever had to feed a growing family, you know it's a lot. Just like Elijah depended on the ravens, families depend on God's provision, often in ways they don't even realize. God knows what you need, when you need it, and He provides, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. God's command of the ravens was specific. "I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." 1 Kings 17:4. This wasn't a vague hope that Elijah might find food. It was a direct, miraculous intervention by God using creatures that would normally never serve such a purpose. The ravens, known for scavenging for themselves, were transformed into messengers of God's provision. If God can command ravens, considered unclean and self-serving, to provide for Elijah, what does that say about his power and care for us? Just as God knew Elijah's location and needs, he knows ours. He knows your name, your address, and even the details of what you need today and tomorrow. This story of Elijah and the ravens teaches us about God's miraculous ways of providing. It shows that God can use the most unlikely sources for our benefit. When the Lord commands, even the ravens obey. It's a reminder that God's resources are unlimited, and his ways are beyond our understanding. Consider this. As God sent ravens to Elijah, he can command all of heaven to wait on us in our needs. This isn't just about physical food. It's about God's ability to provide what we need when we need it, be it strength, comfort, guidance, or sustenance. But there's more to the story of Elijah and the ravens than many realize. God did not allow Elijah to hoard a surplus. He gave him exactly what he needed for each day. This story truly shows us what it means to depend on God daily. It's just like what Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us today our daily bread," Matthew 6:11. This line from the prayer reminds us to trust God for what we need each and every day. God sent ravens to Elijah twice daily, once in the morning and then again in the evening. They brought only enough for each part of the day, just enough and nothing more. Have you ever wondered why God chose to provide in such a measured way? This method teaches a crucial lesson about reliance on God. In our lives, we often strive for security through material accumulation. Many of us have freezers full of food, bank accounts for rainy days, insurance policies, and investment plans. We like the idea of having enough to not worry about tomorrow. However, this abundance can sometimes make it difficult to sincerely depend on God. It's easier to say a prayer for daily bread without truly feeling its significance when our pantries are full. He used an unlikely source, an unclean bird, to provide for Elijah, not just once or twice, but for potentially over 2,000 meals. That's 3.5 years of raven-delivered meals, as James 5:17 indicates that it didn't rain in Israel for that long due to Elijah's prayers. You might think, wouldn't it be more logical for God to use a more pleasant bird, like a robin or a dove? But that's not how God works. He often uses the unexpected to achieve his purposes. It's like God is showing us that he can use anything and anyone, no matter how unlikely, to provide for his people. This story is a powerful reminder that God's ways are not our ways. As humans, we often expect help to come from the obvious places, maybe a rich relative or a well-off friend. But God doesn't always operate in the obvious. He can use the ravens of the world, the least expected sources, to meet our needs. If you find yourself in a Cherith-like situation, a place of hiding or difficulty, remember this story. Just as God had not forgotten Elijah, he hasn't forgotten you. Your needs are known to him, and he has unique ways of meeting them. So when life sends you to your own Cherith, don't be surprised if your help comes from the most unexpected places. God has appointed the beginning and ending of every season of life. In 1 Kings 17:7, a significant event occurs. It happened after a while that the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. This wasn't a random occurrence. The original Hebrew phrase implies it was at the end of days set by God. It's a clear indication that the brook's flow and its cessation were within God's plan. Our God is in heaven. He does whatever pleases him. Psalms 115:3. This verse reminds us that every aspect of creation, even the smallest drop of water, is under God's command. The God who brought the rain also brought the drought. He who sent Elijah to confront Ahab also guided him to the solitude by the brook, and then to the widow at Zarephath. Elijah's life, with its dramatic turns, wasn't haphazard, but a display of God's precise orchestration. Elijah's journey from the mountains of Gilead to the king's palace, to the brook Cherith, to a widow's home in Zarephath might look random, but it's really God's plan happening on purpose. Like Proverbs 16:9 says, "A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." This means that even though we plan things, in the end, it's God who decides how everything will happen. Our plans can change quickly, just like leaves blowing around in the wind during fall. But what God plans is always sure and never changes. Knowing this makes us feel relieved and humble. We don't have the final control. God does. This realization can be liberating. You no longer have to bear the weight of controlling everything or pretending to have all the answers. God is already handling it. So, What can we learn from Elijah's story about the seasons of our lives? First, that every phase, every turn, and every change is within God's sovereign plan. The drying up of the brook wasn't a setback, but a transition to the next phase of God's plan for Elijah. Similarly, in our lives, what might seem like an end could just be the beginning of something new that God has ordained. Second, this story teaches us about trust and dependence. Elijah depended on God for his daily needs, and when the brook dried up, he trusted that God had a plan. In our lives, when things don't go as expected, can we, like Elijah, trust that God is leading us to our next season? Finally, this narrative reminds us of God's provision. He provided for Elijah in miraculous ways, and he can do the same for us. Whether it's through ravens or unexpected means, God's provision is often surprising, but always timely. After a long and terrible drought, Elijah returned. The land was parched, and the people longed for relief. But before anything else, Elijah had to face King Ahab, the one who led Israel astray. Elijah's reappearance was a signal that something significant was about to happen. The tension was palpable as Elijah challenged Ahab, not with his own words, but with the authority of the Lord. This confrontation wasn't just a personal dispute. It was a clash of ideologies, a battle between the worship of God and the worship of Baal. Elijah threw down a challenge. Now then, send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of the Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table, 1 Kings 18:19. Imagine the audacity. Elijah was outnumbered, a lone prophet against hundreds, yet he was unafraid. Why? Because he knew that with God on his side, numbers didn't matter. This story reminds us that it's not about how many are against us, but who is with us. So Ahab called the people and the prophets to Mount Carmel. The stage was set for one of the greatest demonstrations of God's power in the Bible. But before that epic showdown, this confrontation with Ahab set the tone. It was a moment of decision for Israel, a chance to turn back to God. As we reflect on this story, let's consider how we respond when confronted with the truth. Are we like Ahab, quick to blame others, or do we listen and heed the call to change? Elijah's boldness in confronting Ahab challenges us to stand firm in our convictions, even when it's uncomfortable or when we stand alone. The story of Elijah and Ahab is more than just an ancient narrative. It's a timeless reminder of the power of truth over falsehood, of light over darkness. As Elijah stood before Ahab that day, he stood as a source of hope, a testament to the fact that one person empowered by God can make a difference. So let's ask ourselves, in our own lives, how can we be like Elijah? How can we stand for truth, challenge the status quo, and be agents of change in a world that often resembles the idolatrous Israel of Ahab's time? Just as Elijah did, we too can confront the Ahabs of our time with courage, conviction, and faith in the God who never fails. Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. This wasn't just any prayer, it was a plea full of faith and expectancy. He said to his servant, "Go up, look toward the sea." So he went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." Elijah said, "Go back 7 times. 1 Kings 18:43. Elijah's persistence is a lesson for all of us in our times of need. On the 7th time, the servant reported, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is coming up from the sea." And Elijah said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down so that the rain does not stop you." To others, this might have seemed insignificant, but not to Elijah. He knew this was the answer to his prayers. Elijah's faith was so strong that he didn't just predict rain, he warned of a heavy shower. Soon, the sky grew dark with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy rain. The drought had ended, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. But what does this tell us about faith and prayer? The end of the drought was more than just physical relief. It was a powerful demonstration of God's supremacy over nature and false gods. It was a vindication of Elijah's faith and a call for Israel to return to the worship of the true God. Elijah's victory on Mount Carmel is a testament to the power of persistent prayer and unshakable faith. It shows us that no matter how bad things seem, God can help. And if we keep praying, amazing things can happen. This story is an invitation for us to reflect on our own faith. Do we believe that God can work wonders in our lives? Are we persistent in our prayers, even when we don't see immediate results? The story of Elijah's triumph is not just a historical event. It's a beacon of hope and a reminder of God's faithfulness. It's a call to trust in God's timing and power, even when our circumstances seem impossible. So, as we face our own droughts, be they physical, emotional, or spiritual, Let's remember Elijah's example. Let's hold on to our faith, continue in fervent prayer, and watch for the small clouds on the horizon, knowing that they can herald the beginning of great blessings.